So we're starting with chapter 7. And what I started to say was that the origin of the chapters was really created by a Christian monk in the Middle Ages. But it's interesting because the division into chapters in the Christian Bible is different than in the Hebrew Bible, even though the source of both of our chapters is this Christian monk. Okay, now I'm going to add another level to that. In the Jewish Bible, while we never had division into chapters, what we did have was division into sections. And the sections will very often reflect the change of a topic or a subtopic or something like that. So when we see that the first verse of chapter 7 is really in the chapters, it begins, it's like a new idea, but in the way the divisions of the sections are in the Hebrew Bible, the first verse of chapter 7 is actually the conclusion of the story that we've been reading in chapter 6, which makes a lot of sense because what we have in chapter 6 is what happened to the ark. And in the first verse of chapter 7, we find where it comes to rest. It comes to rest in the house of Abinadab in the Giv'ah. And that really is the end of the subject. And that's why we finished there last week. Now, when we start with chapter 2, we're really starting a new subject matter. And the subject matter is Samuel. Samuel is now going to reveal himself to us in chapter 7. We're going to, for the first time, meet Samuel, the leader of Israel. Until now, what did we do? We learned about the circumstances of his birth. We learned something about his family. We learned about his mother. We also learned a great deal about what was going on in the tabernacle at the time. We learned about Eli, who on the one hand is his mentor, is man of God, but on the other hand, he is a very problematic character. Well, he gets this punishment because he has not sufficiently supervised his sons and prevented the corruption that they have led in the tabernacle. But now, in beginning with verse 2 in chapter 7, we're going to meet Samuel as he comes into his own. Okay, Eli is dead. And what we had in between the death of Eli and the capture of the ark was all these stories having to do about where the ark is. Now that the ark has come to rest back in Israel, we are now free to turn to, okay, now what happens to Samuel? And we're going to see Samuel really coming into his own as an adult, as a leader of Israel. Just one more comment that I want to say before we go forced into the chapter is at the end of chapter 6, we learned about even after the ark came into Israel, when it was in Beit Shemesh, okay, we had a situation where the people of Beit Shemesh were struck by God because they saw the ark of the Lord. That's chapter 6, verse 19, okay? And what we had discussed, if you recall, last week was how so much of the way both the Israelites under the sons of Eli treated the ark and the way the Philistines treated the ark as this very pagan idea that it has some like a magic potion, it has magic properties, the way it was decorated, etc. And now it's come back to rest in Israel, and we're hoping that the Israelites have learned their lesson, and they're realizing it's not the ark that has these magic powers, but that it represents God. But we still, and they do recognize this, okay? But then we have this little glitch because they look at the ark. And so that reminds us actually of very similar things, one incident that happened before, one incident that happened after. We know that there's very strict rules governing behavior within the tabernacle, and particularly behavior within the Holy of Holies, which is where the ark sits in the tabernacle. So if you may recall, that amongst the sons of Aaron, there were two sons, Nadab and Abihu, in the book of Numbers, that right when they're dedicating the tabernacle for the first time, they rush in with this strange fire and they are immediately struck dead. Those of you who studied that chapter with me then may recall that while we don't know perhaps exactly, and there's many different interpretations as to exactly what they did, it's clear that they had no business going into the Holy of Holies at that time. The rules governing the entry to the Holy of Holies and when you can view the ark and what you can do with the ark and how you behave, etc., are very, very strict. So even though nobody is questioning the fact that Nadab and Abihu were very good people, this was clearly a fatal mistake. We see a very similar thing happening later in the book of Samuel, in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And there you can look at it if you want, if not, not. But it's a story about how David brings the ark up from here. It's the continuation of this story. In the first one, in chapter 7, we have the ark sitting in Kiryat Yearim in the house of Abinadab. Okay? And it is not until King David is well into his rule that he brings the ark up from this very place to Jerusalem. And then there is also a fatal thing that happens. This ark is being carried on a wagon, and this man named Uzzah, the wagon looks like it's about to slip. The ark is going to slip, and this man Uzzah stretches out his hand to hold onto the ark and prevent it from falling. And there too, God immediately strikes him dead, because that's not how you behave with the ark. Now, stay tuned. We will get to that chapter eventually, and then we will discuss it in detail. But why am I mentioning it here? Because the lesson from all of this is, yes, the ark has come back to rest, but at the same time, what is required now from the people of Israel, okay, they cannot just be casual about this ark, but not just casual about the ark, but casual about anything that is going on with regard to obeying God, worshiping God. God has his commandments and they need to be obeyed. And I think that is a very important background to what we are going to now study. But starting with verse 2, okay, we have the ark sitting in the exact same place it will be until David brings it up later on. And as I mentioned, the message of the previous things that I mentioned was that it's not just a question of the ark coming to rest with the nation of Israel, but there's an underlying message here of the need for Israel not just to welcome back the ark, but to actually obey all the commandments. Okay, are you hearing me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. Okay, so now we're going to see, therefore, that this verse 2 is actually the beginning of the story of Samuel. How is he ruling? And it begins with the fact, again, that the time that this is taking place, the ark is in Kiryat Yearim. It remains there for 20 years. And we learn, and this is kind of like an opening statement for this story, we learn that all of the house of Israel seeks after the Lord. Okay, so that's really a very, very important thing. And here we have Samuel coming before the whole house of Israel, and he's speaking to them. So what happened first? Did Samuel speaking start before the nation goes after the Lord? I would contend that verse 2 is actually like a title, is just kind of saying, okay, what are we going to learn about in this next section? And I think that now we get to see, how did that actually happen? How did it happen that the nation of Israel is yearning or following after God? Samuel gathers everybody together, okay, and he makes a speech to them. He tells them some very important things. He says, get rid of all the idols. Get rid of all these stuff, okay? Now, let's remember that this really the very beginning of Samuel's reign. He's coming on the heels of, we know about the book of Judges and all the terrible things that were going on during that time, and the intense idol worship and the on and off throughout the book of Judges. And we learned about, from the beginning of the book of Samuel, we're not learning that much about idol worship. We learn about a sort of pagan vision of the ark, but we're certainly learning about terrible corruption in the tabernacle, which is then destroyed. So Samuel is essentially starting over. He is saying, okay, we've got to erase all this bad stuff that we've been doing all these hundreds of years, and we have to start fresh. And a good way to start fresh, now the ark is in a safe place. There's no tabernacle. Let's not focus on the ark and the tabernacle. Let's focus on your behavior and how you're obeying God. And he immediately tells them to get rid of these things, but he also says, prepare your hearts to God and worship only him. Okay. Now there's and this is of course what they do. They get rid of all these idols and they worship only God. And when they talk about worshiping only God, it gives us a hint. It's not that the nation of Israel necessarily stopped believing in God, but like we saw on a number of occasions, the nation of Israel is hedging its bets. It's influenced by the nations around them, so it's worshiping this Baal and that Ashtoreth and this all kinds of gods of the Philistines and the Amorites and the Canaanites surrounding them. And they're worshiping God because there was a tabernacle after all until just before this. So what Samuel now is demanding is that they've got to get rid of all that pagan influence. When you worship God, there's room only for worshiping God. And this becomes, very, very important and ushers in a whole new era, the era of Samuel, which is actually very special in that way. And now we're going to go on and we learn a little bit about how Samuel operates. Okay. So then Samuel calls to all the nation and says, gather at the Mitzpah. Now the Mitzpah, the word Mitzpah itself means like a high place from which you have a great view. The word Mitzpah, the root of that is actually view. Okay. So the assumption is it's from some high place and you can see a lot there. And we have actually met the place before in Judges chapter 20, verse 1. Okay. Here we have this was a very nasty use of the same place. This was when that whole civil war, just before it begins, over the concubine from Gibeah, that whole terrible story about that rape of that woman and the civil war that ensues, at the point at which all the tribes of Israel gathered to decide, and ultimately to decide to fight, to attack Benjamin and destroy Benjamin, that takes place. They gather there at the Mitzpah. Now, what's interesting, this is a place north of Jerusalem. There are people that identify it with Samuel, which you may, those of you who have been to Israel just north of Jerusalem, there's this place that has like an ancient tower there, and it's seen as the tomb of the prophet Samuel. And so that's one of the suggestions that maybe that is where the Mitzpah is. Other suggestions is somewhere else, but not far from there. Definitely in the tribe of Benjamin, which is just north of Jerusalem. So that is where they're gathering, and which is, by the way, very interesting because that means if they gathered in or in the outskirts of the tribe of Benjamin, in that book of Judges, to fight against Benjamin, it's like they'd already gathered in the outskirts of Benjamin at a place where they could look down and see all of Benjamin before them. It is a place where you have very great view. Okay, so they gathered there, and then we have a special, and this is going to be a special prayer service. God, Samuel says, "I will pray for you." All gather there. They go through some rituals. They pour water. They fast. They declare their sins. Okay. And then at the end of verse 6, we have a wonderful statement. And Samuel judged the children of Israel in the Mitzpah. So here we have Samuel entering his role. Until now, we know Samuel is a prophet. Here we see him entering his role as a judge in the very similar way that we saw in the whole chapter, the whole book of Judges. Well, all these different people are judges, but here it's very, very different. Here we have Samuel clearly judging the entire nation. We keep having emphasis about how in verse 3, in verse 5, and onward, where we have all the nation of Israel, all the house of Israel. So we have a focus here that Samuel may be a judge similar to the fellows in the book of Judges, but unlike the people in the book of Judges who tended to rule over a given tribe or a given region or to deal with a particular issue, here we have Samuel's functioning as a judge over all of the people of Israel. And so we know he's a prophet, we know he's a judge. Now, the next thing is in chapter 7, we start learning about the Philistines. The Philistines are going to be a big threat. And right away, we have Israel being very frightened, and they immediately turn to Samuel and say, please pray to God on our behalf that he may save us from the Philistines. And then we have a sacrifice being brought, and Samuel calls, this is in verse 9, Samuel calls to God on behalf of Israel, and God responds to him. So here we have, and then it continues on in chapter 10, we have actually the response, the beginning of a war, okay? We have the Philistines beginning to attack, and the response, we don't know anything about an army at this point. The first response is that there's a miraculous response, and this is what you can assume is the meaning where it says in the end of verse 9 that God responded. Here is his response, that he confused the Philistines and he struck them with a plague. Okay, so we suddenly have an army camp that is in disarray. Many of them have been struck by a plague. And as a result, in chapter 11, we now have the army that's going out chasing the Philistines and defeating them totally. So Samuel here, what is he doing? He's judging, he's a prophet, he's praying for the nation, and he's leading them in war. Now, he's not necessarily the general, okay, but part of his role is to gather the nation so that they're ready for war, and that the prayers are in place, miracles are in place, but then the nation actually goes out for war. So in a way, we see Samuel today, even though he's called the judge in the context of a leader really encompasses all the various roles that we saw in the book of Judges fulfilling on a much broader scale. He fills all the roles in one person. He is doing this as a leader of the entire nation. So in a way, we haven't had a leader anywhere like this. At the book of Judges, we have that statement several times in reference to those horrible events at the end of the book of Judges. At the time, there is no king of Israel. And you have a sense you need a unified leader who's righteous, who guides the nation in the word of God. And here we have Samuel, who is absolutely not a king. And yet, in many ways, you can say he's fulfilling that kind of role that they seem to be yearning for at the end of the book of Judges. A one unified leader, a man of God who is leading the nation both spiritually and physically, if you will, or militarily or politically or whatever. And that is certainly what has happened. And we see here in verse 14 that they are able to recapture the various cities that the Philistines had captured before. So it seems to be that there's this sudden, restoration of Israel, both spiritually at the beginning, and now politically and militarily, there's a restoration of Israel to its independence. And then we have a concluding verse 15, and Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. It's just a wonderful chapter, wonderful statement. This is Samuel. And then 16, and he would go, and this is probably one of the most amazing verses about Samuel. And he would go from year to year, he would make the rounds from Beit El to the Gilgal to the Mitzpah, and he ruled Israel in all these places. Okay, so where are these places? So Mitzpah, we talked about, we said that's somewhere in Benjamin, might be Nebi Samuel, which would mean the southern edge of Benjamin. Beit El is the northern edge of Benjamin. Beit El is more or less where Benjamin meets Ephraim. And the Gilgal, that is in the Jordan Valley. That is the place near Jericho where the nation of Israel entered. So the places that he's mentioning here, although he is moving from place to place, he is moving within a very limited area. He's basically moving around Benjamin with a little bit of an area to the east with the Jordan Valley. Did he also go beyond this area? It's possible, but I think the very idea of Samuel, unlike any other judge, like for example, Deborah, for example, is a judge, and we learn where she sits under this date tree, And we have Gideon, who's sitting in a particular place. All the other judges, if it mentions anything about their judging, it is always they're sitting in one place and the nation of Israel comes to them. Here we have a model of a completely different leader. We do know that he has a place where he stays. We have at the beginning that he judged them from the mitzvah. Afterwards, the last verse of this chapter, of chapter 7, it says, and then he would return to the Ramah because that was his home and that is where he ruled Israel. So where is the Ramah? Again, that is considered to be very close in the same general area as the mitzvah. If you think about the name Ramah and you think about the name Ramallah, it is no coincidence. They're probably very close to each other. Just south of Ramallah is a little Arab village called Aram. Okay, and that is where it is believed is the Ramah, that the name Aram, okay, is preserved that name Ramah. And I don't think it's a coincidence near Ramallah because probably it's all part of the same geographic area. So we are thinking of Samuel, who spends most of his time within the boundaries of the tribe of Benjamin. But the very fact that he's wandering from place to place, and I would not be surprised if his wandering would go way beyond the borders of Benjamin. I think the message here is that he is not waiting for the nation to come to him. And I think we see this all the way from the very beginning when he first emerges at the beginning of this chapter as a leader. He initiates 2 different times to the nation of Israel. He wants that. He's saying, okay, I'm gathering all together. This is what you need to do. In chapter 3 and 4, he gives them a very definite instruction about how to obey God and to abandon the pagan worship. It's a spiritual gathering. In the second gathering, okay, he's talking about praying, but part of that is also to prepare for the conflict with things. So he takes initiative. He gathers the nation to him, but at the same time, he's not going to wait for them to come. He's going to go from place to place. He's going to figure out what does the nation need, and he's going to go there. And perhaps that's one of the most significant differences between Samuel and a king. It doesn't matter who the king is. It doesn't matter the king's name. By definition, a king has a palace. He has a capital city. He stays in place. It is the nation that comes to the king. And Samuel here, and I think this will become very, very significant because, in the very next chapter already, we're going to see the nation of Israel requesting a king. But before we get to that, let us appreciate who Samuel was. He wasn't a king. He didn't have any affect. He didn't have any kind of demands for glory or honor. He never had a problem going out on his donkey or walking with his walking stick and going from place to place to where the nation of Israel needed him. You will never, ever see a king who will do that. So that is the chapter 7. This is what I wanted to cover for today. Next week, we'll start with chapter 8, but I want to open it up now for discussion. Anybody has any comments or questions? This is the time. Anyone? Look.
Yes, back in beginning of chapter 7, trying to find the verse, around the verse 9 area. Did you say that the Philistines were plagued?
There was a plague. Yeah, the Philistines, I'll show you where that is. That is in verse 10. Two things happen. God puts out this great call and strikes. One is he strikes confusion in their midst. Okay. And this is a very similar word that's used when we discuss the battle of Sisera in the book of Judges. Okay. You remember Sisera and his army is coming down and meeting Barak, and they get caught in the Kishon River. And part of what happens there is the God strikes confusion into their midst, and that's the same word used here. And then it says that he struck them with a plague. Okay, there's two different things that are happening. I can only assume that it's both. Not everyone is struck by a plague, because clearly they in verse 11 they chase the Philistines. Okay, they chase them all the way, far away under Beit Kar, wherever that is. Okay, so they chase them there. So there is a plague. So some people die in the plague, and there is confusion, but it's not destruction. God gives the Israelites an advantage, but it's the Israelite army who actually ends up finishing the job.
Because in the English, it's not clear, because it just says striking them down. And in Hebrew, it's clear as nagaf, but it's not necessarily
Two different things. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I just have a quick.
And there's actually one thing here that, and I'm looking at verse 12, that I neglected. At the point at which they have this amazing victory, Samuel takes a rock, or a boulder or something, and he puts it between Mitzvah and between this place called Shane, and he calls this rock Even Ha'ezer. Now, Even Ha'ezer literally means rock of salvation, but it's also the name of a place which in English you refer to as Ebenezer. The same thing. Okay. Now, what's interesting is we met a place with that name before. At the very beginning, just a couple chapters earlier, the place where the Philistines defeat the Israelites and seize the ark is called Even Ha'ezer, Ebenezer. Okay, it cannot be the same place, because that place is west, all the way west. It's noted in chapter 4, maybe. It's noted as being near Afek. We know exactly where that is today. It's near the Israeli city of Rosh Ha'ain. It's at the come down to the plains. Okay, just maybe miles from the coast, far to the west of this and the area of Benjamin, which is where this battle is taking place. So we know it's not the same place. In fact, here, not so much that it's calling a place by this name, Ebenezer, he's calling a rock by this name. But I think it's very interesting, and I've seen other commentaries that discuss this, the fact that he used the very same name of where they met their fall, the last defeat by the Philistines. He's using the same name, but in its original positive connotation. You see, you fell before the Philistines in a place called, the rock of salvation. And here we are really establishing a rock of salvation to mark the salvation from the Philistines.
In my Bible, it calls it the stone of help.
Of help? Yeah, help or salvation is both the same. Yes. You could translate it either way. Yes, help is fine. Because he said, until here, God has helped us or saved us, either one. Any other comments?
Earlier in verse 6, is there any special significance they drew water? Is that sort of a purifying agent and poured it out before the Lord and fasted on that day?
That's a very good question. We do know that there are some sacrifices that require this kind of water. For example, during the holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles, we know from our traditions that during the Second Temple, part of the ceremony there would be to draw the water up from the Gihon spring down below, bring them up to the temple, and pour the water on the altar. And I believe there's a few other places in the Bible itself that refers to some kind of pouring water. So it's not like an official sacrifice at this time, but it's clearly a method of sacrifice, or shall we say, some kind of method the people would use in order to show obedience to God, or we're pouring water as a way of saying, we're giving water, we are obedient to you, that kind of idea.
Hmm.
Can I just, on that note, I can't remember where I've heard it, but the pouring of water they said it always seemed to be mentioned connected with sin. And it was often when the water was poured out on the ground, it was to remind them of their sinful nature and how the Lord had destroyed the earth by flood. Would there be any connection in that kind of thought?
I never thought of that. I don't know. There is this idea of water, like the living waters, it is a way for people to purify themselves. We see that in Leviticus. I don't know. I've never heard of that, but who knows? Maybe.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And next week, I hope to be with my laptop in my house.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please
Thank you.
join.
Thank you. That was another
Okay.
exhausting half
See you
hour.
next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to see you in Israel in October.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.